Okay, shall we get started? Sam and Brian, ready?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to our virtual guest lecture today, hosted by Athabasca University. My name is Dr. Henry Tsang, and I am an assistant professor in the REIC Center for Architecture at Athabasca University. REIC stands for the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, to which we are partnered with. I see many new faces and new members today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, warm welcome. Athabasca University is an open online university in Canada, and we are headquartered in the town of Athabasca in northern Alberta. The Center for Architecture offers a range of online architectural degrees in both undergraduate and graduate levels. And it's been kind of a tradition now with these lectures that we've been doing online that we like to start the session by talking a little bit about the weather. So in Alberta, it is -3 degrees Celsius today, clear skies with a bit of snow on the ground. So it's pretty mild for us here in northern Alberta, as it wouldn't be unusual for us to have -20s and -30s degrees at this time of year. The reason why we talk about weather is because we typically have a very global audience with people joining us from mostly North America. Second, we have a lot of attendants from South Africa and the African continent and Europe, and a little bit less from Asia and Australia, given the time zones. But today we're very happy to have a lot of attendants from Cambodia, given the topic of our presentation today. I'm also very happy to see that we have received over 700 registrations for today's event. And it is not surprising given the high caliber of our esteemed guest speakers today. We are extremely honored to have the presence of an amazing panel of speakers to talk to us on the topic of culturally sustainable design, a topic that is becoming more and more relevant in our globalized world. So welcome to Dr. Brian Sinclair of the University of Calgary and members of Zaha Hadid Architects, including Patrik Schumacher, Craig Kiner, and Cristiano Ceccato to our school. And next, I would like to introduce you to our moderator today, Mr. Sam Oboh. Sam is the principal and vice president of Ensight Architecture based in Edmonton, Canada. And he is a distinguished fellow of the American Institute of Architects and former president of the RAIC, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. So before I start, I'd like to ask everyone to turn off your cameras and mute yourselves so that we can ensure an optimized viewing experience and to make sure we have the most bandwidth so that we have a smooth transition between our presentations. So without further ado, I would like to pass the stage to Sam, who will give you an introduction of today's session and our guest speakers. Sam, over to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Henry. Greetings from the beautiful and sunny and snowy city of Edmonton in Canada, and welcome to all our participants from all over the world. I can see very familiar names and faces from the Middle East, from Africa, from Nigeria, from Ghana, the US, everywhere. It's really exciting. So definitely from the registration data that we got, this is one of the most attended global series lectures with several hundreds of people joining from various parts of the world. And I would like to thank our sponsors, Ensight Architecture, Keystone Architecture, Iwanski Architecture, and Gardner Architecture for making today's lecture possible. It is truly an honor for me as the moderator of today's talk, and on behalf of our hosts at the RAIC Center for Architecture at Athabasca University and the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, to welcome everyone to this global studio lecture series titled Culturally Sustainable Design, Sensitivity and Responsivity in a Changing World. Definitely, culturally sustainable design is a topic that is dear to my heart. And the term sustainability is generally understood to refer to environmental performance, passive design, and renewable low energy requirements. While these undoubtedly remain the focal point of sustainability, today, this can be inferred to signify much more: economic sustainability, social sustainability, and technological sustainability, all of which are constituent elements of a civilization, if understood as a temporal society and its cultural output. So in the age, of the growing awareness of marginalized cultures, minority populations, globalized, socioeconomic diversity, it is imperative that contemporary architecture addresses, the urgent need to safeguard and sustain these elements of our society, which otherwise is at risk of relegation. So, safeguarding a naturally sound, healthy environment, environmental sustainability, is the cornerstone for a successful preservation of a distinct culture. However, for a project to be truly sustainable today, it must do much more than just embody energy efficient design. So a truly culturally sustainable design must first and foremost engage the society and people that it will affect, and its designers must confront the historical, political, socio-economic fabric in which they plan to intervene. So today, the societal overlay through historic displacement, immigration, cultural marginalization, and even genocide have led to the erosion of potential erasure of pre-existing historical culture. Understanding the amalgamation of traditions and emergence of new form of hybrid culture require a profound engagement with different members of many constituent societies, their traditions, belief, needs, and a lot more. In this lecture or talk that we're having this morning or afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, regional and international practitioners will showcase a set of guiding principles to an exemplary projects which demonstrate careful analysis of environment, civilization, and ethnicity to create the basis for the synthesis of contemporary socioeconomically culturally sustainable design. With this preamble, it is an honor for me to introduce our distinguished guests panel of speakers, all of whom have known personally for a long time, and having had the opportunity and honor of working with each and every one of them on various initiatives and projects. Let me start with my friend, whom I've known the longest, for nearly 20 years now, Dr. Brian Sinclair. For over 8 years and counting, I've had the opportunity to serve as an adjunct reviewer at Brian Sinclair's comprehensive studio in Calgary and a visiting lecturer at his Tokyo studio, where I learned so much from him and his wife Yuki about Japanese culture, history, and architecture. Brian is a former dean and award-winning professor of architecture and environmental design at the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. As president of the Multidisciplinary Design and Research Corporation, Sinclair Studio, Inc., Brian is engaged in an array of global projects. He holds postgraduate degrees in architecture and psychology, and is an educator and practitioner. Brian's expertise and exploration spans from science to arts. Professional membership includes the American Institute of Architects, the Union of Mongolian Architects, Society of Nepalese Architects, Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, and fellowship in the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. His doctorate degree from the University of Missouri focused on an innovative holistic design planning framework to improve the quality of life for many of the world's poorest people. His scholarship includes professional practice, design methods, open building, agile architecture, ethnography, equity and ethics, human rights, indigenous culture, environmental psychology, international development, systems and sustainability, and the collision of science and spirit, which is an interesting one. He has authored a wealth of papers and journals, books, chapters and books, including the Canadian Green Building Council volume entitled Culture, Context, and Pursuit of Sustainability, and the contribution on spirituality and the city for Routledge New International Handbook on Spirituality in Society and Profession. So welcome, Brian, to the panel, and it's an honor to definitely have you here. Hopefully we'll dive into the spirituality of what we're dealing with here today. So speaking after Brian is another friend of mine and design icon, Patrik Schumacher, whom, if not for the COVID-19 pandemic last year, we would have been in Lagos, Nigeria in spring of 2020 to unveil some exciting initiatives. Patrik, as many of you know, is a close collaborator and office partner of the 2004 Pritzker Prize laureate and RIBA gold medalist, the late legendary Zaha Hadid. Patrik joined Zaha Hadid in 1988, and through the course of nearly 40 years, he has been the co-author of Zaha Hadid Architects Defining Culturally Sustainable Design Projects, including the Magzi National Museum of the 21st Century Arts in Rome, the BMW Central Building in Leipzig, the Nordpark Cable Railway in Innsbruck in Austria, the Antwerp Port House, and the Western Sydney Airport. So Patrik will share insights on how Zaha Hadid Architects became responsible for some of the world's most important architectural accomplishment of 20th and 21st century. So welcome, Patrik. And our third speaker is Cristiano Ceccato, a director at Zaha Hadid Architects in London, and whom it's been a delight for me to work with on a couple of initiatives recently. Trained as an architect and a computer scientist, Cristiano engages across all levels of design and technical development with worldwide project delivery experience on a wide range of typologies. Having previously worked for Frank Gehry Partners in Los Angeles, Cristiano is an accomplished software developer and co-founder of the BIM company, Gehry Technologies in California. Cristiano has spearheaded Zaha Hadid Architects' entrance into the aviation market since 2010. He is the project director for the $11 billion Beijing Daxing Airport in China, which opened in 2019, and now the biggest airport in the world. Other airports in his portfolio includes the Navi Mumbai International Airport in India and the Western Sydney Airport in Australia, which we're going to hear more of in the presentation today. Cristiano is a graduate of the Architectural Association and Imperial College in London. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, where he sits on the Air Transport Specialist Group Board. Our final speaker is my friend and colleague, Craig Kiner, who I've had the opportunity of working with on a couple of initiatives too. Craig is a senior associate at Zaha Hadid Architects in London. He was the project director for the Early and Edith Broad Art Museum in East Lansing, Michigan, and also the project director and manager for the Don Daimon Design Center, a design plaza in Seoul, South Korea. And by the way, a magnificent project that I had the pleasure of visiting in 2017, where the World Congress of the International Union of Architects was hosted. Craig is also the project director for the Sluk Reith Institute in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, which we will hear more about today. He has been involved in numerous master planning and cultural projects throughout his several years with Zaha Hadid Architects. With over 25 years experience, Craig holds a degree in environmental design and architecture, and also a degree in urban design from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Craig is a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects, Urban Design Group, and an academician at the Academy of Urbanism. So without much further ado, may I call on our first speaker, Brian, to give us an overview and his take on the topic that is so dear to many of us, culturally sustainable design. So Brian, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sam.
Yeah.
So Sam, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Very clearly. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll turn my camera off shortly so I have some bandwidth. But before I get started, I would like to deal with a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of reconciliation, we here at the University of Calgary acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani people, the Tsuut'ina, the Nakota Nations, and the Métis Nation, Region 3, and all people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region here in southern Alberta. So welcome everyone. It's indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I would like to first acknowledge Athabasca University for their leadership in hosting this event today. My friend Sam Oboh, the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, Zaha Hadid's office, my colleagues Patrik, Cristiano, and Craig, the sponsors, and of course the many attendees. And just looking through the list, I see many of my students and colleagues from around the globe. So it's indeed an honor to have you here today. My talk is really a preamble, perhaps a provocation, concerning notions of culture and sustainability. As we were developing this session this morning, I suggested adding sensitivity and responsivity to the title, in part to deal with a very shifting and turbulent, uncertain world that we're in right now. We deal with a collision of increasingly bifurcated and polarized realms and populations, including old versus new, rich versus poor, black versus white, the right versus the left, and so on and so on. So it's important that we explore some of these things. In some ways, my talk is maybe a warm-up band to Zaha's office. It's geared towards education, practice, and society, architecture, and obviously well beyond. And it's especially, I guess, tailored for students. So I'm going to turn off my camera and then just jump in. I've got 20 slides, so bear with me. So the Japanese have a term called mono no aware, and it really captures that fleeting moment of beauty. It's at once with us, and then in a moment, it's gone. This is the Tokyo Sakura, the Cherry Blossom Festival in the Imperial Moat, Imperial Palace. Culture is intensely complex. Beauty is found not only in nature, but also, of course, in the human-made. But culture, and especially in terms of our explorations today, is not only about things that are positive. It's also present in the flip side of beauty. In the human-made, for example, this is oil sands here in Alberta with a relatively high ecological footprint. The atomic bomb in Hiroshima in World War II. We live in times where injustices are prevalent, and yet, I would argue, opportunities are endless, and we need to understand and explore both. This is a quote by my friend, the late Majid Turanian, and his co-author, David Chappelle, underscoring the conflicts that we deal with. And this was written at the millennium, and things have only escalated in terms of their severity and concern. Architecture and architects must and can't be seen as outside of contemporary challenges. I argue, rather, that we must be empowered professionals who can contribute to positive change. Architecture is about balance. It's about realms that are concerned with elevating emotions, but also addressing functions. It's about both sensitivity and sensibility. It's a both and versus either or proposition. This is a photograph I took when I ascended Mount Fuji in July of 2013. To make sense of a turbulent world, a change in viewpoint is crucial. We need to get above the noise to understand. We need to understand that a broader view and a wider embrace is especially important at the present juncture, the sort of bringing together of aspects of our society that have been torn apart. My own background tells me of the value of such embrace. So for many years, I was involved in brain research in neuroscience and psychology, looking at single cell recording in an area of the brain called the hippocampal formation, concerned with spatial mapping and cognitive understanding of environments. But also, I delved into and have pursued art, design, and architecture. And it's both of these sides that are important to try and bring together. Our world is rich and dynamic. It's exciting, vital, and challenging, including, of course, for our purposes, design, technology, pulse, culture, innovation, media, spirituality, and Sam was talking about that, and critically, humanity. Our times are complex. They're often confusing. We don't know where to go. This is Mount Asama in Japan, another mountain I climbed. It's an active volcano, so you never know when you're going to get hit by something. We live protected by a thin veneer of stability, and yet our world is really quite fragile. As we know so well, at a moment's notice, all can unfold, all can unravel. We buy things we don't need, with money we don't have, to impress people we don't like. Such chaos and uncertainty results in tremendous pain, stress, and anxiety. And that's not only for individuals, it's for communities, it's for societies, it's for nations. In such an etho, we need to have value and we need to have vision. We need to understand what we're contributing and what we leave. We can't hide and we can't be silent. In all my teaching in many countries around the globe, and I see many of my students and former students with us today from all corners of the globe, a common thread in this search is a search for understanding, a quest for direction, and a willingness to act. This is a photograph taken last March before the shutdown here in Canada of my human rights studio at the offices of Riddell Kersaba, architects here in Calgary. So this constant search for understanding, and it's only grown in importance that our students not only understand design, but understand the context, the culture, the sustainability of design. It's critically about a worldview, which is having a grasp of those things that are around us, but critically, it's about having a self-view, taking a stance, having a position, assuming a posture. We're immersed in a very difficult era, one filled with international wars, cultural genocide, political unrest, national conflict, social inequalities, racial injustices, denial of freedoms, and infringement of rights. This is a search for a solution, a very minor solution, but I wanted to underscore this because it touches upon a number of folks who are with us today, including my friend Sam Oboh. This is a project, the Jinkai Initiative, that was developed by medical doctor and a philanthropist here in Calgary, Emmanuel Guy. He's a clinical practitioner at the University of Calgary. And Sam, myself, Emma, and many others were involved in organizing and then jurying international design competition based in Nigeria, looking at housing for internally displaced people. And in the upper left is one of the winning solutions, which I think in a lot of ways, while modest, underscores this challenge of cultural sustainability and design that is of its place, that grows out of its people and meets local needs. In the midst of such efforts, this is uprising in Lagos just days before our jury was to meet to go over the submissions that we received. Again, this noise, this disruption, this uncertainty that always is with us and that we have to increasingly be capable of handling. We face a barrage of assaults on our ways of seeing, of living, and of understanding via pandemics, food insecurity, disease, global warming, natural disasters, to name but a few calamities. And often, as we know, the hit is asymmetrical. The damage is inflicted not in an even way, but in unbalanced ways. As designers, I argue it's our challenge to find viable paths forward in light of, and perhaps despite of, such problems. Not only regarding temporal issues, such as COVID, but pertaining to longer-term issues, social inequity, spatial justice, sustainability, and so forth. It's critical to understand our world via systems thinking and systematic ways of understanding. The great British essayist C.P. Snow, in his seminal piece, The Two Cultures, warned us of the split of humanities from the sciences, and in a prophetic way, sort of foreshadowed the mess we're in right now. In my own work, I'm involved in an endeavor to bridge the gaps and to heal the divides. Art science, poetic pragmatic, subjective objective, feeling, thinking, humanity, technology, and critically, head and heart. We need to grasp the interrelationships and the interdependencies at play, and this is a diagram pertaining to, of course, the execution of an architectural project. When the systems work, when they operate at full bore, we get great architecture and we get great cities. Into the mix is the need to work the system's various components. And these are just some of them that certainly all of you are attending would understand. The challenges of moving a project from concept through to construction and occupancy. This is a photograph of myself and my wife, Yuki, who Sam was mentioning, and our former mayor here in Calgary, Dave Bronconnier. I was one of his advisors. This is a photograph in London, where we spent a lot of time studying the city, walking the streets, visiting projects, getting into Foster's office and Nicholas Grimshaw's office, all in an effort to better understand the challenges of city building. And then returning home to strengthen our own city. This is Calgary, where I live, and in the foreground with the diagrid is Norm Foster's Bow Building. This is the world at night. All of us know this image. It's a proxy for wealth. It underscores the significantly daunting crises the world faces, especially in the areas that aren't lit, but even now in the areas that are lit. And yet, despite all of this, I still have great cause for optimism. Optimism for the built environment, for the natural environment. This isn't far from my home here in Calgary. And the human environment. This is Millennium Park in Chicago. It's important to stress the importance of meaning to who we are, to how we feel, to how we act, and to how we react. Psychologists talk about place attachment, place identity. This is a Charles River in Praha. Jörn Utzon's Sydney Opera House, which of course is emblematic of the country of Australia. Nicholas Grimshaw's Victoria Station in Melbourne. Studio Fuchsas's My Seal in Frankfurt. But it's not only about buildings and structures. It's also, of course, about us. It's about how we occupy and live our lives in cities. It's about the activities we pursue. At the top is Christopher Day Festival in Hamburg. And at the bottom is a shot from one of the famous night festivals in the great city of Montreal. We talk about place making, but it's critical to also understand place breaking. Increasingly, people across the planet are seeing disconnection and dislocation from their homes, from the places where they find their meaning and identity. Over the last 10 years, the world has encountered an exodus of almost 80 million people forcibly displaced because of conflict and natural disaster, including climate change. I do a lot of work in Mongolia, as Sam was mentioning. I'm a member of the Union of Mongolian Architects. My PhD and ongoing work on the Asian steppe has been very enlightening for me. I work with pastoral nomads, such as this fellow. who for thousands of years have led remarkable lifestyles, no fences, no imprint on our earth whatsoever. And yet, through many reasons, when these folks move into the city, all that shifts when the nomads migrate. We see crime, we see disease, we see discouragement, we see despair, we see depression. I also work on homelessness in Japan. As a foreigner, or what's called a gaijin, I have some latitude to maneuver that my Japanese colleagues don't. And it's really about dignity, and it's about compassion. This is Ikebukuro Station in Tokyo. It's a warm environment, and yet you see the fellow on the left-hand side bringing boxes to give shelter, not from the elements, but from embarrassment and a loss of face. Houses on the Sumida River, a sense of pride and belonging, despite worlds being turned entirely upside down. As architects, the plight and problems of people are, I argue, within our sphere of responsibility. It's neither appropriate nor ethical to turn a blind eye. Design, of course, and all of us here today are engaged in design in one way or another, proves a potent vehicle, a vehicle for action, for change, for transformation. Design can uplift, design can heal, design can inspire, it can stimulate, it can accommodate, it can communicate. Design at its best uplifts us, it rejuvenates us, and it regenerates our environment. However, and this matters, our systems need balancing. They're out of whack. They need balancing in order to design environments that are optimal, that have positive impacts. Right now, it's heavily lopsided, favoring science and technology. And that's problematic for many, many reasons. Briefly, what stands in our way of moving forward, especially in such turbulent times? This slide is called "It's Not My Job." And for many years, I lived in the state of Indiana, where this animal at the front proliferates. It's called "It's Not My Job" because it underscores a problem. In this case, the roadkill removal crew that were to remove that animal, that possum, hadn't got to their task. And then the road line painting crew came along. And rather than lifting the animal up, because it's not their job, they painted over top of it. That illustrates this incredible challenge we have in our society globally of fragmentation. We also deal with bureaucratization, with paperwork, with red tape that holds us back, with isolation, loneliness, abandonment, with ignorance, with indifference, apathy, turning away. This is a public street in Ulaanbaatar, where I work in the Gur settlement near the center of the city. And again, there's no ownership, no responsibility. There's an apathetic view towards the public realm. On the optimistic side, and we have to be optimistic, we can and must find empowerment. We find it through technology, but I would caution there's a double-edged sword, as Plato wrote about in his Pharmacon. Hong Kong on one side, Shenzhen on the other. Through creativity, this is Kisho Kurokawa's last project in Roppongi. Culture, honoring traditions and respecting history. Through research, critically evidence-based design. And on this point, I would underscore the increasing roles of PhD programs in schools of architecture and design around the planet. They're increasingly vital to us getting this right, to meeting society's expectations, but also critically to the role of PhDs and researchers within architectural practice. And it's only and rapidly escalating, which is a very, very good thing. Through integration, which of course is the converse of fragmentation, and through celebration. And by that, I mean the ability to find joy all around us, in things small and in things grand. Given the intensely complicated forces and factors at play in our world, we need new ways of seeing, thinking, and acting. We need new models to guide us, new methods to help us to find roots out of disorder, disaster, of crises, and of catastrophes. We all know this image, John Elkington's triple bottom line, this pursuit of the nexus between the social, the physical, and economic spheres. In my own work and in my own mind, I extend that to include cultural and spiritual, which Sam, in his insightful comments, underscored the importance of. I was invited to write the lead article for the journal Planning Higher Education in 2009, dealing with this issue of culture, context, and the pursuit of sustainability. That was in 2009, and things today are much, much more complicated and daunting. The cover image that you see here is a painting by my wife of a landscape. She's an artist from Tokyo in Japan. It was developed initially during my doctoral and subsequent work in Mongolia, trying to study from multiple vantage points rather than isolated and narrow agendas. Informal settlements are what are colloquially known as slums. For example, and this is the conditions we find in many of these places, as Sam was mentioning Nigeria as well, which also has its share of interesting and difficult informal settlements. This is trash in the public realm. It builds up, it builds up, it builds up till it's a health problem, and then it's set on fire. No one assumes responsibility. It's not my problem. It's not my fault. And of course, we've arrived at a time where we need dramatic overhaul and bold reconsiderations of how we live, of how we dwell, of how we design, and how we build, of the city and of architecture. This is the model that I developed about a decade back and have been working on implementing across those years that Sam referred to. It's a holistic model, and I have a great belief in this idea of a gestalt, or of the holistic approach. It's one strategy among many. It's not definitive, rather it's provocative. It's not prescriptive, but rather performative. It's about catalyzing conversation before tallying any points. And in a lot of ways, it's about straying into territory that we've been reluctant to stray into. And I would point to the bottom right quadrant entitled Delight, which in an era that we live in today, where our mantra is, if you can't count it, it doesn't count, this runs counter to that belief. I included Delight because I believe we have to consider things that aren't easily tabulated, calculated, and put into numbers. Agility, to mutate, to morph, to flex, to change. Fitness, to find resonance with purpose, to elevate our users. Diversity, to provide options, to grant choice, to acknowledge pluralism and celebrate our difference. And finally, delight, uplifting our spirits and stirring our souls. So how do we fuel positive change, accelerate evolution or revolution, be sensitive to culture, which of course is what we're concerned with today, and of course heighten sustainability, which is a rather nebulous yet vital term these days? One way is through education. William Butler Yeats wrote that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. I've thought about and written a lot about pedagogy and teaching. And I would argue, and I just delivered a paper in Valencia in November, underscoring the need for architectural education to stray into difficult territories, including building political acumen, teaching about business, psychology and human behavior, and of course, research, instilling in our architecture graduates an understanding and a capacity to research questions and deal with evidence-based design. Through communication, if knowledge is power, then power must be shared. So we need to explore ways we can do that in positive and productive ways, including in an era of social media. Through wisdom, which is, from my definition, the coupling of head and heart, I believe that as a civilization, we're replete with information, with data, with knowledge, but we lack severely in the sphere of wisdom, of belonging and accepting, and with the idea of cultural sustainability in mind, of deploying local knowledge, of embracing local users and clients and representatives in co-design, and addressing something called culturally led design, rather than flying in and dealing with design from a distance. And resolve through innovation and through integrity. So to conclude, let me say that our challenges are many, they're profound, and they're wicked. But our potential is deep, and our power is exceptional. As I always tell my students, first and foremost, you have to follow your heart. Dare to imagine that you can make a difference, and then act to do so. There's very high stakes, and these high stakes demand our attention, they demand our action, and positive change requires it. I think all of us need to see ourselves in this image of this small boy on his bike. His Highness the Aga Khan wrote, "The right to hope is the most powerful human motivation I know. The world needs tremendous hope in these times. Here's to hope." I look forward to presentations from my colleagues at Zaha Hadid's office. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for really setting the stage for this culturally sustainable design. And that really speaks a lot, regarding what we're going to be seeing from the presentation. So I would like to call on Patrik, to share his screen and give us his presentation. But in the meantime, if there are questions, if people have questions, I think you can write out the questions, and Veronica, Madonna, and Henry may be able to collate the questions for us. Henry, I don't know if the questions should be on the chat box or question and answer, maybe in the chat box, but yeah, please feel free to do that. So Patrik?
Yes, hello everybody, welcome. I'm very happy to join this forum, and thank you to you, Sam, for making this possible. Thanks to the university. And here we have a large audience, so that's very rewarding. And I've decided to take the first 15 minutes roughly and introduce Zaha Hadid Architects. I'm focusing on cultural projects, arts projects, which I believe are very important to create civic spaces of communication, cultural communication, highlights within the cities, and that's where we also developed our repertoire initially. So I will go a bit, show the history and show an overview of the various cultural projects and arts projects we've developed over the years. And then I will go a bit more into detail with one of them, maybe one of the most important, also our breakthrough project, the MAXI, the Center of Contemporary Art and Architecture for the 21st Century in Rome. And that's where I will end with that. So you get a sense of how we approach these projects, but also where we're coming from. So let me try to share my screen right away. And I think I was told to maybe switch off my camera, or I just let it run in the background. So sorry, this was the wrong presentation. Here we go. Okay, great. So I just want to start with an image of Zaha Hadid because her story is amazing. She came from Iraq in the 70s to London at the Architecture School, Architecture Association School of Architecture, where I, by the way, I'm still teaching many years later. I'm just coming in from a review there. And very quickly, within finishing her degree, by the way, in '79, she made the first prize of the whole school, and then moved on to work as a teacher and working from home, basically from her bedroom, and she won a major international competition in the early 1980s. This is the Hong Kong Peak project. So there was a tremendous originality and artistic drive, and this kind of avant-garde. But I think it's also important that it took us a decade at least, in fact, and I joined in between in the first decade of her office, until a first project was put off the ground, and a relatively small one, but an iconic manifesto project in the early 90s, which had a lot of the features which were developed, a new kind of architecture which has the dynamism and complexity of the contemporary condition, the urban conditions. But I just want to throw in as well that this was the early 90s, and then we had another decade where we built very little, next to nothing, but we did a series of competitions, and I've thrown this in because it's Canada. This was our contribution, I think it must be 95, for the Montreal, Quebec National Library, which went to Pat Carr. We didn't win this, but I thought it was a remarkable project. And at the time, all we had was the self-development of projects through designs and representations. This is a studio where we started in the mid-80s, and I'm still sitting there, if it wasn't for lockdown, in the same room. Zaha occupied that one single room, and then we took over the whole building, and now we have a second building, and we moved from the 4 people we initially are 4 people to 450 people. So she got something right with her intuitions and her radical new paradigm in architecture. And we have a few 50, 60 meter, 100 meter away from our old office building. We took on a second building where we're also entertaining a design and architecture gallery, where we're showing our own work, we're showing young artists, students, the studios we're teaching, and also hosting events, etc. So we are well embedded in this whole beautiful little network of architects and engineers in Clerkenwell. So these works evolved in a coherent language of architecture, focusing on adaptability, variation, differentiation, coping with complexity, and maintaining legibility in the face of complexity across all scales, from urbanism to architecture, interiors, and even to product design. So, halfway where we started to building in the early 2000s, this artistic credibility, this avant-gardism was recognized. Zaha and we got been able to show our work 20 years in, filling up the whole Guggenheim Museum, one of only 2 architects ever been given a monographic show. And it was a wonderful highlight to look back on our works at that moment and seeing them displayed. And we are also, by the way, exhibition designers. We've designed many exhibitions previously, also at the Guggenheim, as well as in this case, designing our own show. So we know about art spaces and exhibitions. But what I want to point out is that it was highly unusual. You have this avant-garde, radical innovation, originality, and yet there's a spectacular popularity, which is unprecedented in architecture. You can see here, Zaha Architects, in terms of reference to the web, we are as much as the next 10 of them put together, and continuously rising. So it's an amazing phenomenon that you have that originality and that intuitive grasping of beauty by general public. And that's the way also these buildings, these civic iconic buildings, become national symbols often, or we're filling on so many postal stamps and money, or even the buildings are put on the map like landmarks, which become also identifiers for cities and many occasions. So I think that's very unusual, that coincidence of artistic credibility, originality on the one hand, and incredible popularity, which also shows up in this unbelievable press attention. And it's not only, and that's important, architectural press, but it is broadsheet papers and web, etc. So in terms of artistic projects, or art projects. Cincinnati was one of the breakthroughs, and I will show Maxi at the end. And you can see the kind of robust, the sculptural presence of this building. I will not go into too much detail. You see that we have these kind of rugged and robust spaces, which are beautiful exterior and interior spaces, and a visceral sculptural presence in their sites. By the way, I'm throwing this in as well. 2004, we competed for the Alberta gallery here in Edmonton with this 2005 competition entry. North America, we designed the museum for the Michigan University, and small galleries, an extension of a small French painting and Danish painting gallery in Copenhagen. I'm just going through it. You get to see the diversity. I'm announcing these more. It's a Glasgow Transport Museum. Something very unusual, a gallery space as a bridge in Zaragoza, connecting the main station to the expo site at the time. So we also get into very unusual things, or temporary mobile art pavilion for Chanel, which appeared in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, in New York Central Park, as showing here, as well as in Paris. And again, there is this kind of really working through to the fine detail, both exterior and interior articulations, and have an organic creature which makes sense in many ways. And so the connection with Lagerfeld was quite interesting at the time. And we won with this project the UK Heritage, Architectural Heritage Sensitivity Prize, because it's very new and different, but the way it sits in a kind of a historical setting, and a little back garden at St. Anthony College in Oxford. It's kind of beautiful, the way the building swings around the tree and has an internal complexity, even though it's relatively small. And similarly, I'll show you a few of these smaller highly context-sensitive buildings. This is Serpent and Sackler Gallery in Hyde Park, extending. We also converted the old ammunition storage into a beautiful art gallery, and then did the social space, extending of the lightweight tensile structure. And the wonderful event spaces, which we personally use as well a lot for gatherings, for exhibition events, openings, and corporate events. And then we are lucky to sometimes have these fantastic sites. This is for Reinhold Messmer, the great mountaineer. We did the Messmer Mountain Museum. This was spectacular in the Italian Alps, where we literally cut that building through the mountain, and then you end up onto participating and domesticating and this fantastic mountains with the museum. Is wonderful. But also these kind of quite unusual and strange creatures initially got enormous pushback when we published renderings in Korea after it was finished, and the architects in particular were saying it's not very sensitive, but it's something which fits with the topography. It fuses park with building and can fully exploit a very irregular site. And there's a number of sunken courtyards, integration as well of archaeological sites, and you can move below it, above it, and underneath it. So it's quite beautiful. You can see here the kind of sculptural treatment of using concrete, using beautifully formed and perforated aluminum panels, both exterior and interior. So this kind of sculptural treatment and detailing out of our products so that they have a visible sense of strangeness and beauty and don't pull you back into banality of everyday life. That's very important for us, that we deliver on our buildings in the level of detail as well. And you can see here, it broke all records and all expectation with nearly 10 million visitors in the first year alone. Only the Louvre is the more visited art venue in the world, and we have 4 permanent museums within the building, a series of temporary exhibition spaces, and particular fashion been occupying this. We have Seoul Fashion Week, we have Chanel Fashion Show, and you see it becomes an amazing center of activity and draws a lot of people. And there's very little public parks in Korea, so it's also during the day very much beautifully frequented. And similarly, the Baku Art Center with the National Library and concert hall and an art museum, and developing the exterior park spaces around us, and having the building addresses the outdoor spaces on all sides, and is a beautifully transformative interior design where everything is integrated. A staircase just flows together with lighting lines, and this is about maintaining legibility in the face of complexity, not to clutter up the space. The complexity of the space is intriguing enough, and to suppress then detail and let the detail guide and flow you through the space, and then have shifts in materiality as well, and the warmth, but at the same time the similar language continue. Lately, we finished also this amazing project. It's an opera house, a museum, as well as a multi-purpose hall in Changcha, setting up a whole new district on a new lake. And just a few glimpses of that. It's been some amazing interiors, the multi-level lobby, and this unbelievable auditorium. And that's the way we can use digital design and controlling geometry and file factory, certainty with respect to what we're doing when it comes to complex geometries. And that's where we have been mastering now over the years, and the execution is very well. So this is a museum with a big atrium and big gallery spaces, and the kind of urban setting and the interarticulation of the various buildings. So now this is the overview of what we've done culturally between large complexes and very small kind of jewels. And just I thought it useful to go a bit into detail on a project like Maxi, so, and how we're thinking. So these are the sketches where we're starting. We're taking the urban fabric, it's the striations of the old sheds, which are still maintaining, and then using the idea of a display wall where we're hanging paintings and where light comes in from the top, and to irrigate the site with display walls, exhibition walls, and using the old components for the cellular space. So I have a totally clean flow of continuous, endless, moving and evolving display space, always framing walls, top lights, and sometimes bifurcation, sometimes layered when you cross levels, and then have something which is quite graphic. And you can see here the way the layer detailing the lobby represents the overall complexity of the diagram. So here you have this insistence that all the elements, whether they are walls, ribs, staircases, are brought under formalism so that they flow and guide you through the space, and they don't become clutter up the space. And that this is also machinery of displaying art. So all the ribs you can hang, heavy sculpture, light filter through from all the way. And urbanistically, you can see the way the river marks that territory, and these curves resonate with that, but also the way the different urban directions are picked up and integrated in the building and mediated by curvature. So there's a lot of urban integration and affiliation. So it's not a simple object, but it develops a synergetic fabric with the buildings around it, with the urban texture around it, which is now transforming, spearheaded by Maxi, into a whole cultural district. And the way these spaces flow, so there's a beautiful simplicity in some of the spaces themselves, but a complexity and the interest in the overall. And this is a way, for instance, the urban axis cuts right through the building and leads you through. And then the surfaces on the outside, they're also, they've been used for projections, for banners, and there's a lot of solid spaces, but there's also a lot of transparency from the outside, from the garden into the building. And then the incorporation of the existing building. This kind of hugging and integrating and absorbing the existing building for in this case, also for the museum shop, some of the offices and so to keep the new building pure gallery. And then you can see the kind of interfacing of old and new, the concrete overhangs, the light coming down, and these are also then become display spaces on the outside. And covered plazas, and you can see glimpses to what's going inside. You look into the gallery spaces. And they become display zones as well, where you can look back at those from the gallery, look back into the exterior as well. So these are some of those beautiful moments where you're inside the building, you look through the outside, back to the inside, into another gallery, into another path, back into the urban. This kind of deep layered vistas are something we love, that kind of layered urbanism. And then you have the spectacular lobby space where these staircases and ramps create a kind of nodal system which brings you back into the main building and mediates the various levels. And then from there you move into these very calm gallery spaces. But the gallery space, they keep moving. There's no termination. You keep rolling, but the character changes depending on how much light we're getting, lateral light, top light, etc. And then the moment of intersection where you can change levels, that's where these lines intersect, as the diagram predicted. And then you reach at the top, you're invited back and connect back with the urban fabric. These are some of these details. It's concrete, steel, and then we have the white surfaces to hang the art. They're very robust suspended walls, by the way, and you don't see any piping. And the floor is tough. You can put every load on this, and all the air is behind the wall and sucked in at the bottom and comes out at the top. So a lot of attention is paid on how the technical systems are integrated and don't interfere with getting natural light coming through at any point. And again, as I said, the deep vistas and the interesting, beautiful layeredness of looking up the terraced daylight gallery, and then at the same time looking out into the front yard, and not being kind of too much encompassed in a hermetic world. I think that's very important. And these deep vistas are wonderful. Of course, we have the whole system of hanging walls, of building up walls where you can subdivide the space more. And then another moment of interchange, of changing levels. And a lot of them are ramps. And again, as you come up to the top floor and this very large panoramic window, one of those kind of few termination points in the project. And now so the attention to detail is very important. So the concrete walls, no chamfered edges, a beautiful satin surfaces, and we took a whole year of casting in the basement to refine and perfect with the contractor the concrete before we came out of the ground and allowed them to cast over ground. And these walls are not just walls; they're long span beams. Some of them 30-meter spanning beams. And again, the way we integrate with the existing, and pay attention. This is the auditorium. Different characterful situations, but the palette is always gray, black, white, and to be relatively neutral after to then allow the art to become, let's say, more prominent, more colored. So this is in terms of detailing. The columns. Something you'll never see is in the back. This is the escape stairs, hidden. But again, we never let go of let's say, artistically integrating all the elements. And then it was beautiful when you come in and you suddenly bring in the art. And I have some images of even the lobby space has been used for displays, for hanging sculptures. I mean, there's a lot of interesting situations for site-specific artistic interventions, as well as the more neutral, simple, minimalist, let's say, exhibition spaces, of course. But here you had the opportunity of mounting monitors on the staircase. And this area here is actually where the cafe and bar is on the right-hand side. And then you have these spaces. They could be quite bright. So we have no direct light, of course, because there's a grill. And then we have adjustable louvers to bring in more light or less light. You calibrate, you can make it very bright, of course, if you have no graphics, no paintings, but it's a sculpture base, and you can really flood the space with light, which is beautiful. And you can see here is a beautiful complexity. You can see some of the walls which can be placed and received into this. And massive projections and I love to go back, and there's also cuts all the way to the top gallery where we have a glass floor. We were very keen on having this layeredness and visual connections inside, outside, across levels, so that you always have an orientation. You never kind of hermetic and isolated. And then some of the wonderful exhibitions this is the Art of Power exhibition. And there's been some amazing exhibitions. We were allowed back in, and they hosted a Zaha Hadid exhibition as well, and only the top gallery, which is quite large, and the whole passage towards it, and it's only a fragment here of our show in that. And so I stepped back, and some images of the original opening. It was a wonderful event. I mean, so crowded, so beautiful. And it's so rewarding to see, going back every now and then. I've been lecturing and going back for visits and lectures to see the way the space always transforms, the way the exterior spaces are utilized. There's much more green now in the exterior as well. And there's many simultaneous shows possible in this building, and that's usually the way it works. There's an architecture museum, an art gallery. There's of course a lot of educational space as well. So that's the pitch. I mean, just focused on this particular project, and to give us our attitude, the way we do work with concepts, like the display wall as a driver, and the way we do something transformative and uplifting, which I think you're looking for when you come to an art space. You want to be transformed into the space of possibility, yet of course it has to function very well from the curatorial aspect and from having all the public gatherings work very well. So with that, I hand over.
All right, thank you very much, Patrik. That was really interesting, and there are actually a lot of questions in the. I've just been going through lots of questions, so hopefully we'll be able to get through the rest, the remaining two presentations, and then we'll get into the question and answer session. So for all the participants, please keep the questions coming. And
I stay on. I will answer the questions. Don't worry.
Yes.
As much as that, if they're directed to me, I'll have a long night.
Absolutely, there are lots of them for you, for Brian already, and I think let's go through. So Cristiano, I will get you to share your screen, and then we'll get going, on that. And I know just for our participants, we did schedule this for 1.5 hours, but we will go beyond it. So we definitely understand if people sign up, but we really want to exhaust this topic, and so we crave everyone's indulgence to actually be with us till the end, because it's going to be an exciting one. So Cristiano, over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for having me today. I was really impressed with Brian's lecture. I think it's one of the most impressive lectures I've seen in a long time. A lot of food for thought, and a good segue both into what Patrik was saying, and also hopefully what you're going to see now. In the interest of time and focus, I was thinking of what to talk about. There's a lot of projects, as Patrik has mentioned, that have been done over the years. And I believe Craig and myself are going to focus more on a specific project that looks at an example of what culturally sensitive and culturally sustainable design might be about, and how it could manifest itself. So kind of going from the general to the particular, and from the theory to the practice, and hopefully keep the conversation focused. And I may echo some of the themes that Brian so eloquently discussed as well, because they're a very good segue into this. So this is, I decided to, I hope you can see the screen okay. I decided to just really kind of focus on one project that echoes many of the issues that have been brought up today. Obviously, we could go on all day and talk about possible projects. Brian mentioned he made a little introduction about the acknowledgement of the local people that you may do in a place like Canada. And in my case, we've been working now for about 1.5 years now on a new airport in Sydney, Australia, in the western part. and that exposed us to many, many different notions about Australia and what Australia is today. And one of the things that you learn is that there are hierarchies, and I'll get to them, of immigration and hierarchy of reclamation of land. The foundation of which, of course, is the Indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginal people. And when you normally start a project of this type, or you start a meeting of any kind in Sydney, what we would normally do if we were in Sydney now is I would make an acknowledgement of country, which would say, we acknowledge the Darug people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand, and pay respect to their leadership, past, present, and emergent. So it's important to point that out, that there is a, in the cultural diversity that you have in a place, much like in Canada today, you have that in Australia, there is a kind of a root in its Aboriginal people and its Indigenous people. This is an image taken from the existing Kingsford Smith Airport International Terminal, where our partner firm Cox developed this roof system, and from which they hang the identity flags of some of the individual nations in Australia. And it's interesting to see that there's a whole other level of identity. Every time I would go through this airport, I would spend quite a bit of time looking at these flags because they're very beautiful, but also because I didn't understand any of it. There's something there that is evocative, something there that you can somehow grasp as an image, but you don't understand really where it comes from because you're lacking the cultural foundations. And as somebody who spent a long time in Australia working on this project, having not spent too much time there before, it was really kind of a cultural indoctrination. So one of the things that you realize about countries like Australia, perhaps Canada, and a few others, New Zealand and so on, is that you have layers of immigration, and you have layers of, if you like, cultural appropriation of a land that, in the case of Australia, goes back almost 40,000 years with the First Nations, the so-called Aboriginal people. And we become more aware of it as a Western civilization from when Captain Cook first set foot there. And then what you learn when you go to Australia is what's called the First Fleet in 1788 that arrived in Sydney Cove and in Botany Bay and basically established the very first colony from scratch. So Captain Cook found this promising land, and then and then the British then dispatched a fleet of I think it was 11 ships with 1,400 people to establish the first colony, which became famously a penal colony in the 1800s. And it wasn't until well into the 19th century that people began to actually emigrate into Australia and actually build a nation. So the people coming out of the penal colonies, together with new immigration, began what was effectively then the colony of Australia, which then became the Australian nation. What became interesting after that is that you have a series of waves of immigration after the sort of the basic British and English immigration. So after the you had a series of them through the early 20th century, but specifically after the Second World War, you had a completely different layer of society immigrating into Australia, Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavian background people. And that created a whole new level of Australians, which were then now supplemented since the late 20th century with a whole new layer of immigration, people coming from China. If you go to Sydney today, most of everything is bilingual, English and Chinese. You go to Australia today, you'll find that most people around you are either Chinese or South Asian, Indian. You have a lot of Arabic people, African people, Brazilian people, creating a whole new other layer of culture. Now, what's interesting about this in the context of the Western Sydney Airport is that the founding of Sydney and really of modern Australia was in Botany Bay and then in the Sydney Cove, which you see on the bottom right. And where it says Botany Bay, roughly where the letter Y is, that's where the Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport is today. And if you look above that kind of fjord-like harbor, that is a Sydney harbor, and you can just make out the word Sydney, which is where the Sydney Cove was established. This is on the hard east coast of Australia. And so the city couldn't grow there any further. And as you'll see, a lot of that growth with new cultures and new immigrants is happening now to the west. So this kind of traditional image of Sydney that we're all aware of, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Opera House, all of us who've been working on this project have got to know this very, very well. And the different neighborhoods that exist on both sides of the Sydney Cove here is something that is a first image, if you will, of an expanding city that has made its mark further and further inland. So when you understand the way that Sydney grows, the original Eastern Harbour City, which is where the Sydney Cove is, you see Botany Bay on the bottom of that blue splotch there, that is really what's called the Harbour City or the Harbour CPD. That is what has the Opera House right where that black dot is. That's what has the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And so Sydney at this point today is a city of 4.5 million people. It's projected to grow to almost 9 million people by the year 2040. So effectively, you're duplicating the population of the city through immigration primarily, but requiring all the kind of infrastructure that you require to make a city of that size work. And the green stripe that you see on the very far left, those are the Blue Mountains, and that sort of creates a kind of a physical limitation, a physical barrier where the city can grow. So it's growing really from the east on the right through a new development at Parramatta, which is what's called the River City, the Central River City, which has the Parramatta Inlet. And then further to the west, you have the Western Parkland City, which is right now very, very rural, but it integrates new communities such as Liverpool, such as Cabramatta, and other new towns that are emerging, which are all now clustering around what will be the new Western Sydney Airport, Aerotropolis to the west, which is effectively a new pole of this third central city component. So that's something that basically by implanting the Western Sydney Airport there with its infrastructure is something that is now basically becoming a catalyst for the urban growth around this from the east to the west. So as you start dealing with this project, you realize that the kind of the value system architecturally and societally that you have on the eastern side, which is a traditional point of immigration, and if you like Indian English descendancy culture, no longer applies as you move to the west, because on one hand you're coming out into a rural part of effectively the beginning of the Australian bush. The presence of the so-called Aboriginal Land Council is very strong. And also it is the only place with space. So a lot of these new immigrants from places like Brazil and Africa and China find that that's where they go and live, Arabic background. So you get fantastic Chinese food, and you get, as you'll see, fantastic food from around the world, which is very, very different than the city. So when we start approaching a project like this, we have to start thinking about what is it that that we need to do. And our client would tell us, well, you need to create an airport that has the passenger and the customer at its heart. That's kind of a given, but it's a sort of slightly deadbeat basic approach of what you might want in a contemporary airport. For us, it was important to have something that was unmistakably Australian. And by unmistakably Australian, as you will see, it incorporates everything really from an understanding of its history all the way back to the Aboriginal First Nations, to the different layers of immigration, but also distinctly Australian culture that has emerged from it since, architecturally as well as, if you like, societally. Something then is not just Australian, but it's distinctly about Western Sydney, and it's distinctly about that part of New South Wales, which is very, very different from the Sydney with the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. And so it doesn't just become a second airport for Sydney, it's really seen as Western Sydney's own kind of gateway. So this idea of using this as a platform for integrating different cultures, for reconciliation, this is something I believe also in Canada is something that Brian mentioned before, is something that's very, very important. So connecting with the land, its place, the people, establishing kind of placemaking and a sense of place becomes really, really important. So when you start thinking about heritage, the heritage goes to the idea of traveling all the way back to the way that Indigenous Australians would travel. And the idea really there was this idea of crossing country. So as I mentioned before in the flags, there are many, many small regions of Australia which are different Aboriginal nations, much, much larger than just the states of New South Wales, Queensland, Southern Australia, Northwest Territory, the Northern Territories, and so on, Western Australia. There are many, many small Aboriginal nations that are interspersed with the tribes. And when you would cross from one nation to another, what you would do is you perform a smoke ceremony like the gentleman on the top left. And that would mean that you would acknowledge your presence at the border between one nation and the next. And you would make yourself aware to the custodians and the inhabitants of the new nation you were about to enter. And it would allow them to come and welcome you and discuss with you the purpose of your trip and bring you in. And that is how basically cross-cultural pollination would happen between different Aboriginal nations. What happened since then, as you see on the bottom left, our future is really about this new kind of immigration and a new kind of religions, cultures, and peoples that have been coming in. And on the same time, the emergence of a distinctly Australian architecture that was an emergence of bringing in a Western, if you like, European architecture, and then finding that it was wholly inadequate to the climate of Australia. And so what happened was, during the 19th century, is this particular need of being able to work sparingly with limited materials that were found there by the colonists. The emergence of something as typical as the veranda, which is this idea of a covered external space that would create a space that you could inhabit even in the harsh heat of Australia. And at the same time, where this was all forged into a new national character, particularly in the First World War, where per capita Australia suffered by far the most losses in a war that was very, very far away from home. So this kind of created an Australian spirit of comradeship, of being mates and of being supported, and something really beautiful that you find in a place like Australia when you really spend time there. So the question really is, how do you distill that? And how do you begin to establish a sense of materials and a sense of language, of colors that may begin to evoke the place that you're working in, but also start looking at how do people all the way back to the original Australians begin to communicate information. And what's interesting about that is that Aboriginal ideographs are very, very similar and very much in line to the way we kind of use, say, pictograms and ideograph icons in airports today to help you navigate your path through the airport. And suddenly there was a connection there for us that started looking at where are the cultural elements that exists on the site that in fact allow you to tie something that is as old as 40,000 years with something as contemporary and functionally complex as a contemporary airport. The colors, the materials, the language. Another thing that's interesting, again, we are in an academic conference this evening, is the relationship that we built with Western Sydney University. The Western Sydney University became, from the day of the competition, a partner for us. We started talking to the students. Eventually, we started collaborating with design studios there. This university is relatively new, and it's placed deliberately in Western Sydney. So it's located with its headquarters in Parramatta, in the central River City, and then on to having additional campuses in other places towards the west. And it caters to a population of a lot of these new generations of immigrants. So you have people who come from Arabic background. We had one student who was from an Iraqi background, but born and raised in Western Sydney. And you get, these very interesting kind of personas emerging who clearly have a way of dressing. Maybe they're from an Islamic background or from a Chinese background, but they're talking to you like Australians, and they're all kind of a new kind of Australian. And so it became a whole new presence where itself the university has been designed in a contemporary way to look at the climatic conditions of Western Sydney and begin to distill the kind of cultural emergence from that. As I mentioned before, one thing to point out, in the western suburb of Sydney, these are all pictures taken from there. You have in places like Cabramatta and places like Punchbowl, you know, you have the largest Chinatown there. You have if you really want to have a great Chinese New Year, as we did, we went, you'd not stay in Sydney, you'd actually go out to western Sydney suburbs, much like you will if you lived, I used to live in LA a long time, and you'd go to Alhambra in the east of LA, because that just happens to be where you would get the best food and the best culture, or you get African food, Ethiopian food, Middle Eastern food, in this same part of Sydney. So the question really is, how do you begin to then look at architectural gestures and expressions that, on one hand, you know, we were working at Zaha Hadid Architects, working in partnership with Cox Architecture, which is a very large and distinguished architecture firm set up by Philip Cox in Australia. And we decided to work together quite a long time before this airport, driving a lot of the aviation work. I got to know my counterpart at Cox, David Holm, and we decided early on we wanted to do this project together. And these are some of David's sketches, who's been working a long time in Australia and starting to begin to look at what is this idea of horizontality? What is this idea of an environmentally in tune architecture that would be in line with this particular project? And what's interesting here, you can see on the left there, David and myself working over a lunch table, is really a discussion of finding your way, because, you know, we had never really worked in Australia on such a complex project before. And David perhaps was not used to having, you know, people from abroad coming in and sharing their thoughts. And we had to find a common language during the competition process. This is taken from the competition, to begin to find a common ground where we could really develop a solution together. So this kind of emerges from a dialogue, you know, this idea of horizontality, the idea of, in this case, you're looking at the Blue Mountains, which is the western edge of the Sydney Plain, and extracting from there different ideas of movement, of form, but also this kind of idea of filtration and of space. And different kind of things would emerge from investigating the landscape. One is the very, very beautiful Blue Mountains and the escarpments, which are kind of a canyon, but not quite as deep, that emerge out of this kind of cracked landscape as you come to the western edge of Sydney. And also one thing that this is actually taken from the site you can just see to the right-hand side, they're starting to clear the site of the Western Sydney Airport at Badgers Creek in the heart of the Western Sydney landscape. And what you start seeing here is an emergence of what we call the Great Australian Light. So this vastness of landscape, you might know this from the plains in Canada, that looks like an infinite sky. And it's something we wanted to capture, that horizontality, but at the same time, this idea of light filtration, the Australian bush, the eucalyptus trees, again here taken on the site on one of our visits. And how do you reconcile this kind of light filtration with this idea of endless horizontality, and begin to sort of look at themes that might come out of that would then yield a building, which was this design that is very much expressing the language of the region, but in a very, very contemporary way. So we have this kind of idea of a flowing roof. You see movement inside. We'll have a look inside, which you know, has this idea of movement that is something that the Zaha office is very interested in flow and dynamic. And what happened was that we started looking at these different functions that you require within an airport by overlaying with themes that came from different architectural topics within contemporary Australia and its history. So if you're going from the land side, so from where you get dropped off to the bottom of this image to where you actually finally get on the aircraft on the top of the image, you'd go through these different service zones and these different layers where you'd cross a veranda, a typical Australian veranda, protecting you, but also from the sun, but also creating an environment that might be semi-ventilated. You have different passenger processes, and then you cross this idea of the Great Australian Light, which was this idea of a canyon that would go through multiple layers of the building and allow natural daylight to come in, not just to people leaving. You know, a lot of airports have a great experience when you leave, but when you arrive typically in a sort of an underground squashed zone, and we wanted everybody arriving to have an equally fantastic zone. This idea of the ochre gathering, which in this case was a commercial point where you could do some dining and shopping, is really where Aboriginals kind of get together and have an exchange, have a dialogue. It's kind of like a summit location for them. Before you do that crossing country, which I mentioned before, and you're stepping off, in this case, Western Sydney onto an aircraft to some other part of the world. So in section, this is an early section of the design. Again, you see on the left, you have the drop-offs, you have the forecourts, you have this idea of a veranda where you slowly go from the exterior to an interior. So we wanted to blur that interface between the exterior and the interior of the building as you find your way to, you know, through different functional parts of the building. And you get to this Great Australian Light, which you see in the middle there. And it's a double height space, triple height space, in fact, where this kind of idea of natural daylight filtering through this undulating ceiling would actually bring natural daylight all the way down to arriving passengers who are waiting for their bags and might have to wait a while, and maybe they've been on a plane for 12, 15 hours from some other part of the world, possibly coming from places like Turkey or Qatar, and places that are more connected to the kind of immigrant population that you have today. So these different kind of functions were integrated with different themes that we found. And we started looking at what kind of devices might be possible to facilitate this. So I mentioned before the idea of ideographs and pictograms. We explored things like the language of information. These are early studies that might be adaptable from a language of ideography to the specifics of what you require, you know, in terms of gates and wayfinding. But also we started to look at the idea of working with, we worked with art consultants, and we worked with contemporary indigenous artists who would work in a lot of different media. So you'd have indigenous artists who would explore the idea of crossing country, but through very advanced digital technology. So they could create this idea of that, you know, depending where you are in the space, you'd get a mediated space, and that would then again react to people in them. So using quite advanced, sophisticated digital technologies to move through a space, and working with other contemporary artists there who would take traditional things like basket weaving on the bottom left, but come up with very, very new and different kind of objects that would become something that become like mnemonics of moving through a space that is very contemporary and yet very much echoes its location. So a couple of images to conclude. This is the departure and arrivals level. You see on the left the idea of a penetrable facade, the idea that it can be semi-ventilated, and the beginnings on the ceiling of this continuous undulation that is then used to filter light and provide, therefore, an intuitive kind of directional wayfinding through the building. So as you move through the, I'll skip the aviation functionality because I don't want to bore you with why the building is organized in a particular way. But suffice to say that that horizontality is something that takes you through that space. Here we're in the departure levels above. And as you're moving through, you see in some of the commercial shopping area, you can see now just behind this glass wall, you're looking down into the arrival space in that Great Australian Light, which is a central canyon that is the core part that stitches together kind of an experience for both departing and arriving passengers. Before you carry on, you see departure lounges on the left and then onward towards the gates. So if you look at that same space from the arrivals point of view, I've just gotten off a very long flight from somewhere, and I'm now waiting for my bag. And I as I see people departing above, I also have access to this beautiful light coming in and streaming in. It's very uplifting, it's very relaxing, and after a very long trip, it's something to celebrate potentially the very first time you've ever been in Australia, and a new kind of first point of impact. So that horizontality is something that plays itself out in the airport. It has to do also with the way the passenger flows are organized between domestic, international, and mixed flows. Again, subject of another talk if you're interested in that kind of aviation technology. But in conclusion, basically what we're implanting is a new airport. This is all 4 terminals combined. In the future, we'll have a capacity of over 80 million passengers. So we'll become the largest airport in Australia. It's the largest federally funded federal government land acquisition project in Australia at the moment. And we are in the middle right now of tender evaluations for our contractors. We're going to start then working on the terminal in the months ahead. So with that, I'd like to thank you and hand back to the team. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Cristiano, for that. And I think we should just get right into Craig's presentation, which is the last presentation, and then we'll get into the question and answer, session. So
Yep.
Craig, over to you. You just have to share your screen, Craig. Yeah, good.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Well, good morning, everyone. Allow me to welcome you all as well. Thank you, Dr. Singh, Sam, Dr. Sinclair, in Global Studio, the School of Architecture and Planning and Landscape at University of Calgary, the RAIC, Center for Architecture at Athabasca University, Patrik, Cristiano for their contributions. It's an honor to be speaking with you today, and always great pleasure to speak about the Slook Reith Institute in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. This topic of resilience and sustainability, which Brian, you mentioned and very eloquently again kind of raised, are terms, however overused, have profound and far-reaching consequences in design, environmentally, socially, economically, and culturally. Culturally sustainable design must fundamentally address the historical, political, and socioeconomic contexts in which they operate. In many respects, when considering the history of a place, the indigenous peoples, culture, and societies, and examining how they lived, they were far more sustainable, far more contextual, and their footprints far softer than our modern approaches. We are both indirectly and directly contributors to the cultural marginalization, historic displacement, and in some cases, genocide, cleansing of indigenous cultures. Fortunately, I believe we have matured and have learned to have a greater appreciation of our indigenous cultures, to protect their societies, their traditions, beliefs, and needs, which leads to a more holistic awareness of place in history. Through genuine involvement in the design process, we both must understand and acknowledge the impact we have on the planet and the places we work, positive and negative. And Brian, I think you raised this issue again very well, maximizing the positive benefits whilst minimizing the negative impacts. Our interventions must deliver the greatest contribution to place, to the environment, to the urban realm, public space, and for the widest of audiences. This idea of inclusivity for everybody. How our work improves and enhances the lives of the people who use them, for the visitor, but most importantly to the citizens, to provide the utmost enjoyment, meaning, and uplifting experiences. So my talk is predominantly about the Slook Reith Institute. It's a facility that's created for the Documentation Center of Cambodian, DCCAM, either Documentation Center of Cambodian, is an independent NGO. Since 1997, has been given the authority to retain all the documentation related to the atrocities carried out by the Khmer Rouge. Its founder and director is Yuk Chang. Both he and his members of his family were victims of the Khmer Rouge. I personally have the greatest respect for the Institute, their board, and their incredibly dedicated staff. They have been tremendous hosts throughout our journey. The name Sluk Wreath is derived from the dried palm leaves from the Trang palm tree. Cambodian religious leaders and scholars have used these for centuries to document the history and preserve culture during the most volatile times in history. The name of the Institute has been taken to symbolize this documentation process, as well as represent the delicacy of the action, strengthen the ability to hold on to, document and preserve history through the fragility and the poetry of the material. Qualities of the Cambodian people, their strength and ability to survive whilst maintaining dignity. I suspect most of our audience are generally familiar with the events that occurred in Cambodia in the 70s with the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, and the incredible pain and suffering of the Cambodian people during those dark years. What most do not appreciate, however, is the victims and perpetrators continue to live side by side in the country. So it is within these contexts, some more severe and emotional than others, that design must engage with place and people, addressing the historical, geopolitical, cultural, and socio-economic fabric. The SRI is a venue that manifests these challenges in the most profound and sensitive ways due to the subject matter and purpose of the facility. So how does one begin? At the very start of the process, we needed to educate ourselves. We embarked on a broad journey of discovery and awareness, understand the place, comprehend the rich and complex history of the country, of the Khmer culture, the atrocities, and the relationship of the Cambodian people with their land, water, and life. Our client, DCCAM, insisted on an extended site visit as in a week, to understand the place, people, the life and culture, the architecture and the art, as well as the construction systems. The life of the majority of the Cambodian people revolves around water. The mighty Mekong River and Tonle Sap Lake and River provide sustenance and life. We were really fortunate to have the guidance, knowledge, and commitment of Mr. Chang and his colleagues at DCCAM to offer that insight, awareness, and understanding of the place. We are led across the country from dawn to nightfall, visiting many temples, museums, markets, and islands, speaking with individuals, the monks, access to the archives. DCCAM operated as both our client and educator, effectively becoming our Indigenous cultural consultant at the earliest stages of our journey. So looking at Cambodia, the most celebrated and globally recognized identity are the magnificent temples of the Angkor Empire in Khmer culture. The temples are located across the country, many hidden and almost consumed by nature. Angkor Wat, the largest and most well-known, is comprised of 5 temples across a vast landscape of water retention and detention ponds that collected rainwater during the wet months, directed from large areas into multi-level reservoirs for use of fresh water in the dry seasons, for drinking, for irrigation, life. The temples are the primary surviving features of the Angkor Empire, The village and inhabitations have been lost to weather and the elements. However, with the recent use of aerial-located LIDAR 3D scanning technology, the vast extents of the Khmer cultures and civilizations have been better documented and understood. Into the exploration of the Khmer temple architecture, we were advised to seek inspiration from a smaller, less well-known temple, Bante Shrai, also known as a Citadel of Women or Citadel of Beauty. It wasn't a royal temple, that one was independently commissioned. The richness and articulation of the detail is quite astonishing, often referred to as the jewel of Khmer art. The temple comprises an extraordinary assortment of mythological narratives in the stonework that served as an inspiration to inform our design. So how does one begin to design? To create a living memorial, a monument which commemorates the past, and an educational resource for the future. We began to document the qualities, the physical and emotional attributes the facility needed to embody. The project is exceptionally poignant in the way that it combines a strong educational and outreach function with a deep social justice function and the commemorative nature of a memorial museum. How to articulate space which exemplifies those qualities. We sought a memorial that is not something we visit once and contemplate and file away. Ideally, we find a way to integrate the memory into our daily lives in a positive and meaningful way. We sought to create spaces that achieve both a character of quietude and reflection, with branches that reach out to the landscape and other areas of the building. The phrase, neither forgiveness nor apology, implies an honest neutrality. The building should achieve this straightforward, matter-of-fact quality. And the design for the exhibition spaces would focus on structuring artifacts and memento mori, not sentimental, but allowing history to speak for itself. We did not seek justice alone, but also healing and transformation. These spaces should not be neutral, but communicate atmospheres of contemplation and healing, using light, shadow, and texture to communicate these. The architectural language should have the capacity to handle somberness, tragedy, lightness, framed by hope and joy. We tried not to focus on the past, but rather sought to understand and look to the future. The creation of an inspiring place for a new generation of forward thinkers, i.e. the school. Those who will understand the tragedies of the recent past whilst looking for ways to move forward, to heal, to live with that understanding. The quote, Cambodia will never escape her history, but she does not need to be enslaved by it, resonated with us throughout the journey. We attempted to answer a number of fundamental questions in our search. How does one begin to commemorate the enormous sacrifice of so many innocent human beings at the whim of an irrational and criminal enterprise? How does one design a commemorative monument that does not drag future generations through a visual assault that provokes shame and fear? How can we offer design elements that stimulate remembrance, but also redemption for the past and hope for the future? And how can we productively position the memorial within the horrendous legacy of the Khmer Rouge into the larger context and perspective of Cambodia's lengthy history? DCCAM's founder, Yuk, Chang, founder, sought to complete his vision for victim memorialization project with the creation of the Luke Reith Institute, which was formed of three primary components: the Museum of Memory, the School of Genocide, and the Global Research Center. But when contemplating the design, our concern was to break away from traditional models of victim memorial architecture, i.e. avoiding the tedious, minimizing negative emotional responses, and emphasizing reconciliation and hope. So at the start, DCCAM, they searched for an architect, and they searched beyond the normal pool of architects known for victim memorialization projects. They specifically wanted a female, as in most victims of mass crimes are both women and children, which are normally the innocents. A search for someone with roots in the developing world, and of course, creative talent. So Zaha Hadid architects were commissioned by DCCAM to undertake the design of the Institute. It's an archive, a museum, a school, and a library. But most importantly, it's a place for Cambodians and world citizens to contemplate the past, whilst looking with hope to the future. Place of peace, reflection, and reconciliation. We aim to create a monument respectful of the past whilst creating an enduring symbol for the future through education, learning, and understanding. This idea of a living memorial. So we sought inspiration predominantly from place and people, the symbolic nature of architecture and the atmospheric effects it can create, working collectively with the operational aspirations to achieve a unified whole. Typically, memorial architecture is built from stone, the kind of the heavy mass, a monumental material that we felt anchors one to the past. We wanted the design to convey a sense of lightness, openness, peace, and healing, be uplifting. Therefore, we look to wood and timber as a natural choice to provide this sense and a counterpoint to the more traditional monumental architecture of stone and mass. Much of the inspiration for the genesis of form and how the volumes nest and intertwine have evolved from the indigenous landscape of Cambodia. References have been made both from the lotus flower, the building volumes blossom as they arise, but the collection of structural elements have drawn inspiration from the heavily wooded areas of Cambodia. We were drawn to a specific tree, the Shraloa tree, which grows in bundles straight and tall, reaching to the sky. And we drew a poem between the tree, the Institute, and the people of Cambodia, individually pliant and resilient, as are the stems of the tree. However, when bundled together, a greater strength, resolve, and we believe optimism is achieved. Both the structure and facade draw on this gesture of bundling for the articulation of elements and the composition of volumes. The Luke Reith Institute should express this sense of lightness, transparency, and delicacy, which conveys the sense of tranquility, hope, and healing for all occupants and all visitors. And we believe that wood, timber displayed these qualities best. Natural light through living material. All of the building functions, museum, library, school, and institute, are inherently linked to one another. And the building should allow for all the close collaboration and mixing of different users to enhance the understanding and the sharing of knowledge. At the same time, the building should allow for the discrete functions to operate simultaneously and independently. Each department should have its own identity within the building. They needed to maintain a level of independence, but equally interconnect to facilitate the physical connectivity from one to the other, but equally to represent the interrelationship and continuity of space within the Institute. The independent volumes nest together, creating spatial events at the junctions. The vertical structural members intertwine, which generate a complexity of space and structure, which are again representative of both the Straloa tree and the forest. Whilst the climate is very warm and humid in Cambodia, we want to maintain a close environmental connection between the building users and place through maximizing the use of natural light and ventilation. The main structure and facade of timber, whilst independent and distinct, elements are aligned to ensure the visual continuity and expression of the material throughout. The spacing of the timber louvers of the facade reduce solar heat gain, whilst allowing light and air to penetrate the system. And consistent with Khmer architecture and of course responsible practice, we collect and attenuate rainwater and reflecting pools at the ground and upper levels in the building for use as water features and for the sanitary facilities and irrigation in the landscape. The building is placed within bodies of water, synonymous with much of the temple architecture of Cambodia, providing light and reflection and continuity between land, water, and life. The unique elements were identified within and across the Institute at the main entry, crossing over and through the reflecting pools, demarcating the threshold and transition between interior and exterior space and the flow of light, air, and space. The nesting junctions between programmatic volumes are incredibly important spaces where one makes visual connections across the voids, the zones of the facilities, and the diaphanous screens between spaces. Within the school and the education facility, providing a field for contemplation and study for the interior spaces, framing a reflecting pool at upper level that are representative of the rainwater reservoirs of the Khmer temples, blurring the boundaries between ground and sky as in the temples. And the connection to the ground, the Khmer culture and the indigenous vegetation and landscape. And with water, reflecting the life and the memories and hope of the people. So I'd like to share a video created by ourselves and mirror imagery.
Thank you very much, Craig.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really inspiring and a good way to, finalize, the talk around what Brian was talking about in terms of spirituality and also the diversity of the project. So Henry, maybe you want to give us some housekeeping, talk before we get into the question and answer, because we have quite a number of questions and I'd like us to go through a number of them that are really quite important.
Yes.
I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, first of all, to all of our speakers, Brian, Patrik, Craig, and Cristiano, for the inspiring and amazing presentations. We are a little bit over the allotted time, but we would definitely like to take some questions. So we have asked our participants to send their questions to either myself, the host, or Samuel Oboh. So I've directed already all of the questions that I received to Sam. If you could, Sam, can you confirm that you see the questions?
Yes, I see the questions. Yeah,
we've received quite a few, I think, on my end at least.
There are some common themes, and I think we'll just go through, some of those very common, themes around the question. So we can just start with.
Just pass it to you, Sam, and if you can curate the questions and direct them to the whichever speaker.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Henry. Yeah. So I guess we'll start with the low-hanging fruits. One of the first questions, which is actually quite interesting. One of them says, I'm a high school student with great interest in humanitarian architecture. Do you have any tips, for me when I start studying architecture regarding how to best learn to make a difference through designing? And I think I'll direct this to Brian because I thought this is really quite interesting, right? Coming from a young audience, participants in the program. So just briefly, Brian.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to the student who sent the question. It's an encouraging question. I think young people are awakening to the need to focus, regardless of their occupation or career, on the more human and humane sides of what we do. I think, in particular, the Zaha last project in Cambodia, to me, as I was reflecting on Craig's comments, it deals with incredibly powerful architecture that is beautiful, that is poetic, and yet at the same time that is grounded in thoughtful research, in sensitive listening, and listening to the land, listening to the people, listening to the history, and also an inclusive process. So my encouragement to the high school student is really, as I said in my presentation, follow your heart, learn from the sorts of practices that are being brought forward by folks like Craig and Cristiano and Patrik. Architecture can be deeply meaningful. It can serve humanity in powerful ways, and it's more than just sculptures. So that would be my advice. Very good question.
Good. And that also answers another question about a non-designer or an everyday man of cultural sustainable architecture movement. And beyond being an image that says 1,000 words, to maybe taking part in the action alongside with architects, and designers, what do you think? Do they have a place?
I guess from my perspective, our architectures act as conductor or a maestro, for example, in an orchestra. But increasingly, that orchestra is made up of many, many players. And I think that for architects or for architecture to take an elitist stance where we know better than anyone else is problematic. We certainly have roles to play in guiding the process and inspiring the process and leading the process. But as Craig was saying, in terms of the inclusivity of process, and Cristiano was pointing to that as well in the Western Sydney project, it's no longer the case where we can just do it ourselves. I think it needs to be inclusive. We need to listen well. We need to listen locally, and we need to sort of broaden the players to embrace the diversity that all three of the Zaha speakers referred to.
Thank you. So the next question I think I'll direct to Patrik. I'll start with the low-hanging fruit, Patrik. There's one of the participants asked a question around, oh, I've heard of Zaha many years ago in London. The only question I have is how an architect like Zaha became so famous. I know you've answered the question in your presentation, but you know, there were 3 or 4 questions like that. So I thought maybe we should address that. So over to you, Patrik.
Actually, her first fame was in the student population, in the discipline itself. I mean, when I became a young student in Germany as a provincial boy, I came across her works and was just mesmerized and stunned. I mean, this is, you know, drawings published in magazines, which are quite specialized. There was an AA publication, Planetary Architecture. Then there was the next publication from Japan, and they've been circulating. And that's where she first built her reputation, totally internally. And then through that mechanism, getting chances to compete. I mean, at the time also, there was more open competitions where you didn't need a track record. That allowed for that also to take place. So, and then of course, the more popular general public at that time anyway, would rely on first build successes, which were then kind of noted and through a media. The architectural critics are basically the mediation vehicle from the internal discourse into a more wider, maybe cultured audience, and that's where the way it happened. Today, I think there is different dynamics. You can with the rendering and innovative rendering that can go viral through Instagram. It's faster. It's more unpredictable. So I don't know if what the experience of Zaha, which in a sense was a long haul, is necessarily the way it works today. But that's the way she became well known. It took really for a general audience to recognize her and her works. Took, I would say, 20 years after her first emergence as the insider star at the AA, as winning the big school prize, etc.
Yeah. Okay. No. This next question, I think, can go to anyone on the panel. I thought it's an interesting question, and the question reads: in Southern Africa, we have gone through and still going through massive cultural and political upheaval, where we have massive cultural and economic diversity and disparity, especially in our bustling cities. And the question is, whose culture, in parentheses, prevails? So, you know, I thought this is an interesting question, looking at the Cambodia project and some of the initial talk that Brian gave. And the question is, whose culture prevail? And is that really the question? What should the question be? Maybe Brian, you want to start?
Sure, I can say a few things, and then I think some of the Zaha colleagues could chime in. It's an excellent question. I've spent time in South Africa. I've visited the big cities as well as the townships. It's an intensely complicated situation. My simple answer would be all cultures have to coexist. We need to move to a place where we move beyond tolerance to respect. There's a lot of talk about being tolerant. I think that's the wrong language. I think we need to respect. Craig was talking about the need to understand, to listen well. And I think the more we can get to that place, the better off we'll be as countries and as societies. But on a maybe less optimistic note, you know, around the world, we're seeing a sort of subtraction of that push towards common understanding and the sort of bifurcation and polarization that I was referring to in my comments. So all of us need to pull together. It's a very, very tough challenge. So I'll turn it over to the Zaha colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, Craig, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Brian, absolutely. That's right. I mean, I think we've got to be as open as we possibly can when we go to a place, when we're honored to kind of intervene in a place.
Okay.
And we've got to listen to everybody that's there, everybody that has a voice. And I think the kind of the days where you go in as the kind of these parachuting consultants into places, and then you kind of you just fly out. Those days are kind of, well, they were never right to begin with. But I think now there's, if you're ever going to make a real difference in a place, that you've got to understand a place before you even put pen to paper, as it were, in the old days. So
I mean,
whose culture is it? Whose building is it? I mean, it's everybody's. It's got to appeal, as difficult as that may be, it's got to appeal to everyone. And it's kind of, it's almost our duty to be able to do that. Go ahead, Patrik.
Well, I mean, I think that respect is a great notion, and I agree it's better than tolerance. And I think what we need to realize, obviously, that the respect for person and personality and doesn't mean that one couldn't be critical of ideas. And what I've seen too many times around the world, that the same mistakes which were made in, you know, in fast track development, in terms of erasure of cultures, of urban sprawl, because of the immediacy of pressures, in the end, 10 years later, 20 years later, turn out to be very costly. So, and we've seen it in China, we're seeing it, there's a risk of this happening in Africa now developing. So one comes in with a lot of respect and sensitivity, but also with experience and potential critique and guidance. And that shouldn't have been, of course, in no way be a stance of arrogance. It's a stance of service and sharing of experiences and insights. I think that's what the balance we have to get right, and that's not easy. But the main thing is where we have the risk, which I see a lot of times in discourses around the world, that become too aggressive. If we have difference of ideas and opinions, it shouldn't mean that we should undermine each other as persons. I mean, we start to be able to separate ourselves from our ideas. That's maybe also we can learn new ideas. So I think that's something which we do in conversation with clients, and I think it's also in the educational environment where we need to have respectful but vigorous exchange of arguments. And
maybe if I can just very quickly add to Patrik's comment, and Patrik, your comments are very apropos and thoughtful. I think the question of whose voices do we listen to, and how much weight do we give those voices, whose history do we understand? Because the victor writes the history, and that history is often less than accurate. So I guess from my point of view, it sort of underscores the need for research and the absolute pursuit of truth. And who owns truth? That's something all of us have to grapple with. So thank you, Patrik.
Yeah.
Can I just add one note to that, which is when I look at the project that we just been through in Sydney, I mentioned something about this historical layering, and you're right. You could argue that the victors were the British when they first came in, and they established kind of a tabula rasa society that only now is beginning to, and I think only in the last 30 years has begun to become really, really acknowledged in Australia as something where reconciliation is really required. They really use that word. But on top of it, you have also these new layers of immigration, which also need to be processed and which need to be factored in. And it makes, on one hand, for a very complex situation. On the other hand, when you're saying whose culture is it, it's a new culture that's emerging. If it's done properly, it's something new. And there's a lot of discussion in Australia at the moment, for example, about will they maintain the monarchy once the Queen is gone? Because she's really held it together. And it's a very good question, because there are people there who are born in Australia of a younger generation who have no relationship with the monarchy at all. It's an imposition that, yes, it's kind of there, but there's no reason for it. And so something new is coming out of there that, in a way, the question almost, if allowed to evolve, it answers itself.
And actually, you've all answered my next question. I'll still read it, but and then move on to the next one. And the question was about, culture and architecture, that should it be aspirational and should it be reflective of the society today? Where do we find the balance, especially if we consider the context of economic disparity? And what Patrik, Brian, Craig, and Cristiano just talked about, I think answers that, beautifully well. So, I guess the next question, one of the participants sent a question to say, hey, if time permits, I want to say congratulations on being chosen for the Shenzhen Tower C. The movement in the design is spectacular. What was the inspiration and meaning for massing? Also, what program does your firm use for your digital models? Now, the reason why I'm reading that question, even though that project wasn't presented per se in detail, is because there are few questions like that around what programs do you use for your design, opportunities, and all that. So I thought maybe I should put that through to the Zaha folks. I don't know, Patrik, if you want to start with that.
Well, I just want to answer to the last question just a little bit, because I think it's important.
Yes.
And I had this epiphany when I was in Isfahan in Persia. And if you look at our building in Cambodia, you get the similar feeling. So you have these wealth disparities, and you have a lot of people living in poverty in these urban centers. And that's what you have in Isfahan. You basically have an old town, which you might, in terms of the comfort levels and what delivers, is some kind of a shanty town. And all around these beautiful monuments and gardens, which were built hundreds and hundreds of years ago, which have this kind of luxury, but it's a public luxury. And you have that identification and usage of all the public spaces with picnics, and so a poor population has a luxury of public space, and that is lasting, that is delicate, and I would defend every dollar in inverted commas or resource which went into this, if it does this kind of uplifting aspirational image, and also social spaces created. We have the same discussion we can have it with our Cambodian project, or in Algeria, where we developed a palace of sorts. And that was my answer when I went there, that one can have that, because if you have millions, the benefit these public spaces deliver, in particular if they have a lasting value for generations, that would justify for me. And you can have an instant cost-benefit calculation where you say this money could be used to uplift a million people for what, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? And what about next year and in 10 years? So that's why I believe that one has to be quite take a step back and in terms of evaluating also beautifully crafted and long-lasting significant architecture as an investment for a nation, its aspiration, its self-conscious, but also the daily use. Yeah. So this of course applies to exceptional public buildings of public significance. And in terms of the Tower C, well, thanks for noticing. I mean, it's an interesting mixed-use tower. It's set into a parkscape, a kind of headquarter cluster, but it's a public investment initially. And what is very, very special about this, that the tower bleeds out in open terraces and tinted surrounding, and allows the public to move through right underneath as well. So we can do that structurally. So you have this kind of, the first 10 nearly to 15 level are highly public and porous, like a cascading terrace, the hanging gardens, if you like, and then it pulls up and becomes a tower. But then at mid-level, you have another kind of public intervention bridging. So I believe these larger tower structures with atrium, bridges, and an interesting interfacing with public space on the ground, they're nearly like little city districts. I mean, that's China. And I think that was convincing to the mayor of the city and to the decision makers. And again, they can imagine that this would be costing more. Maybe it will put another year and another 10-50% onto the project. And for us, it would spend, it puts the extra over hours. But again, there is this evaluation that the thing, what we're creating here is of significance. That doesn't apply to every single building. But we have come to be specialized in taking on special projects. And then, I mean, it's beautiful, Craig's talk and Cristiano's talks. I'm very proud of you guys and happy that we created a kind of a group where we have the experience, but also then take the resources when we develop these projects and ground them in depth, but also be original and aspirational in our translation. And that needs to happen. You can't wait until all the last poorer dwelling is refurbished before you do a building of public significance, because then you have to wait 100 years. So that's the dilemma, and it's a tough one to think and defend, and but we must tackle that.
Yeah, and quite a number of questions around sustainability. So I'm going to combine a few of them so that we address them all at the same time. And actually, the first question around the sustainability was directly related to the Magzi Museum that you presented, Patrik. And the question is, the spirit and joy are certainly there, but so are the carbon dioxide emissions. I couldn't see anything green. Is there any? I know that.
I mean, yes.
You'll talk about that in a moment, but let me add another question on sustainability so that you tackle it at the same time. The next question was, how high are maintenance costs? Maybe you can give us a comparison of some regular projects that don't exist in your studio, in Zaha Hadid's architects studio, since they are full of different lights and also exposed natural concrete. So I thought maybe just to kind of like tackle those at the same time.
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, of course, Maxi was opening 10 years ago and was designed 20 years ago. I think it's very contemporary still in terms of its attitude, the public spaces, and it's in terms of the concrete. We love to use structure and build something which has crispness, solidity, and has then internal flexibility. There's a lot of natural light coming in. But of course, now we would use a recycled concrete. So in terms of the embodied energy, we really could bring it much more down, which we've done since at the Aquatic Center, when we also won them prizes with respect to ecology. So this project was not yet under that level of scrutiny and pressure, and we were green in a different sense. We were immature and we couldn't focus on everything at the same time, but also the time wasn't there yet. So yes, that project in terms of the concrete has a lot of embodied energy, of course, and of course you can imagine if you have an art museum where you also need to have humidity control spaces, they are quite intensive with respect to mechanical systems. But in terms of, we do have we have ventilation potentials and daylight potentials in all the public spaces, even in the daylight gallery where it's not going to be paintings and graphics, but sculptures. So we have actually in the ceiling, we have these ribs cutting out the direct sunlight, first of all, and then we have a circulation of air in this double glass, which is acts as in terms of heat loss, acts as a very good buffer. So we had started, and of course we're working in London with fantastically innovative engineers. So if not in the competition, in the working through with Max Fordham in that case, we did a lot still to have a conscientious, environmentally conscientious building.
So this is a question for Cristiano. Do you think there is a need to re-establish special occupied areas as it relates to culture? For example, calling eastern parts of Australia, New Australia, and the Australian bush to original Australia or something. So that history isn't left in the past, but is somehow brought up in the contemporary design space where you no longer have to travel far to experience it. So Cristiano, I don't know if you...
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it's a question that was discussed quite a lot. You know, do you create, you know, how do you bring something, you're referring, I assume the question is referring to Aboriginal people and the First Nations there. And I think one of the things that was debated a lot was, you know, do you give Aboriginal people, for example, a space in the airport where they can have a showcase of their culture, where they can not just participate in the design process, which was something that was really it was a requirement by the client, but do they actually, for example, get a space within the airport, or do they get a way to look at the landscape around the airport that in a way is, you know, commensurate to their needs? I think one of the things that was even discussed was, do you even have something like a theme park? So people who are visiting in transit, for example, at an airport for a few hours can come out and they can get taken to an experience that allows them to see what this kind of culture would be like. The truth of the matter is that it's now a series of cultural overlays. And the question is, how do you actually help people of that kind of background, of Aboriginal background, become a player at the forefront of contemporary Australia, rather than isolate them into something that's kind of like a historical park, while you're celebrating that culture and you're celebrating those cultural elements. How do you actually bring them to the forefront within contemporary Australia? Because contemporary Australia is, and I'm sure in Canada that you must be tangling with similar problems, which is this forced overlay of many different cultures, you know. And it's not just the Aboriginal Australians and the English, but as I said, you have people coming in from China, people coming from Arabic background, people coming from South Indian background, African background, and it all gets kind of tumbled together. And the question is, how do you, you know, it goes back to a question we had at the beginning, which was whose cultures predominates. So I think what is happening overall is that there's a strong effort by the Australian government to make things more inclusive today, where people are acknowledged, where people are actively participating. We, for example, in the design team, we had people who were actually Aboriginal Australians, you know, properly trained architects, so they were working in the team. And it was very, very important to them because they were working on their land. And we learned a lot working with them. And it allowed people, you know, through the office and the offices that we had established there, and also the university that we were working with, to give a direct input by these people onto a process proactively, so that they wouldn't become some kind of marginalized sort of phenomenon, but they were actually part and parcel of something new that we were trying to construct in contemporary Australia, so that the new Australia, in a way, is something that is just emerging now.
Yeah. No, thank you, Craig. I think we'll soon be wrapping up. One of the reasons why I thought it's important to address these questions is because this has been recorded, so that, you know, people can have time to visit, you know, the recording. And I do know that the video is going to be posted on the Athabasca University, you know, webpage, on their YouTube page, most likely. And I think Henry will say things on that. But, you know, there's a few questions on the Slick Reef, you know, project, Craig. And one of them is, what is the impact of the Slick Reef design building regarding the delay of the groundbreaking? In Cambodia, some of the buildings look similar, right, to your design nowadays, right? So talking about like the impact of that, of what that project has had. And in similar vein, Craig, another question on that is, do you think it's possible to generate parametric indigeneity, where the indigenous people culture is not seen as something that was that was and informs design, but rather a culture that is extrapolated into the future under conditions that it didn't suffer, corruption and destruction, but further innovation. So I guess the question, is probably, talking about, the parametric, indigeneity, which is an interesting term, in there. So Craig, I'll let you do that. And finally, Craig and Cristiano, still within the same line around that question. How is it, there was a question around, the whole, indigenous, wherever, it's important to inculcate all those indigenous, aspects to the projects. But what about, the employment and getting them involved in the project? So if you guys can just tackle that in a GBA, start with Craig, maybe.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. And thank you for the questions. Yeah, it's a difficulty when the design has been kind of published and is out there for kind of public consumption, and it takes kind of a long time to realize the building, and it's still in kind of early design stages. And then people see it, or designers see it, or whomever, and they kind of acknowledge or recognize the kind of the potential significance of the building or the design, and then they begin to try to mimic it somehow. I mean, that's happened with the office a number of times. I can remember one project, which I won't mention, but it was actually built before. But anyway, I mean, it's a challenge for us. But when you're trying to achieve something that is incredibly kind of meaningful and significant in a place that, and you have to remember, Cambodia is a very rural and poor society. I think they're still suffering from, the things that happened 50 years ago. So, and the kind of the mean income is almost nothing. With regards to the parametricism, I think I should allow Patrik to answer that question. And then
Yeah, I mean,
maybe,
okay.
Yeah, and maybe Cristiano can start to address the third question, and then I'll come back afterwards.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I love the phrase parametric indigeneity, and actually I've coined the phrase parametric regionalism already, because we'll have the whole idea of parametricism is that you have parameters, for instance, from the various engineering logics, fabrication logics, material logics, and environmental logics or forces, and this is all about adapting to these local conditions. So and the regionalism can be absorbed, and particular, I think there is we all know about this biomimetic research where architects and engineers and designers try to learn from biologically evolved structures, because they have a high level of functionality, but also there's a kind of amazing creativity morphologically. But the same applies in the way with respect to the vernaculars of this world, who have evolved over hundreds and thousands of years sometimes, and they're highly adaptive, in particular with respect to local resources, but also with respect to environmental conditioning in the absence of active systems. So these are beautiful passive systems, and they've figured out how to work to build durably and ecologically sound, and also achieve comfort levels. And we've looked at in the Middle East and desert cultures, in tropical regions, in cold regions. So that's a general research paradigm. But then you need to bring it into the science and into parametric design in a sense, because these structures, they're usually quite subtle in their adaptation and variation. They recognize topography, they recognize asymmetries of exposure. So yeah, it's a research paradigm. Parametric indigeneity does exist, yeah. And it is happening. Except so far we even call it parametric regionalism, but I love parametric indigeneity, so I'll pick that up and run with that.
That's good. That's good. So, Cristiano, there quite a lot of interest on the airport, project, and one of the questions did mention that you made no mention, at least that the person asking the question, heard about the great Aussie outback tradition and adventure culture, right? Banjo Peterson, swagmen, cattle drovers, waltzing, Maltida, and so on. Any influences or reference? And and is the new airport intended to contain any other function and purposes other than simply coming and going? Things like education, entertainment, display, exhibition.
Well, it's an interesting set of questions. I'll try and be synthetic about them. There was a question also about employment, and as I mentioned before, we have people on our team who are Aboriginal people who I think also represented various backgrounds of different levels of immigration in Australia, and it just reflects the society that we live in. Also working with the Western Sydney University, where that is a big part of it, is that kind of new heritage that they're inventing for themselves right now. In terms of what we tried to do, and I think it's very similar to Craig's project, we tried to not create something cartoonish. I think that would not have worked. In terms of Australia, and you think of Crocodile Dundee and people wrestling with alligators and crocodiles and sort of going bungee jumping off the cliffs. That wasn't really what that project was about. It was really about a synthesis of a cultural condition that Australia finds itself in. It also was about addressing a complex issue, which is certainly very present in current transportation debate, which is if you're building an airport, you can get criticized for it because you're burning fossil fuels. A lot of aviation technology today focuses on reconstituted fuels. It has to do with looking if you can use electric power, if you can use hydrogen power, other means of enabling transportation without polluting the world in the traditional sense through the burning of hydrocarbons. That is a non-trivial task. I mean, working with the Royal Aeronautical Society, we see how difficult that problem is, simply because other forms of propulsion do not have that same level of productivity that, say, Jet A1 fuel has today. So the balance is somewhere in between, but certainly what we wanted to produce is something that addresses these issues both culturally and sustainably from the beginning. We had on the team not just a sustainability team, the client fielded a climate change control team. So what we were doing is actually looking at the trends of climate change in the Western Sydney region up until the year 2060. And looking at, based on not what you're designing for today, but what will climate change that is invariably happening in the world, how will you be addressing that? How can you actually increase the performative aspect of the building? And actually halfway through design, it became something that the client mandated to increase the performative aspect of the building, its envelope, and the way that it's cooled and so on. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that you're trying to create something that is distinctly humanistic, because an airport is a means of communication. It's something that brings people together. The more we bring people together globally, the more people get to know each other. And we find that we have more in common, as I said before, as people than we do that separates us. So an airport is a great device for that, because it brings people together that otherwise couldn't be together or have emigrated and will never see their relatives again for, 20, 30 years. At the same time, it represented an opportunity to reconcile ourselves with levels of history within Australia, all the way back to the Aboriginal people. And as I said, we worked very closely with the Garangara Aboriginal Land Council in the Liverpool area to make sure that they were not just aware of the process, but they were actively participating. The fact that we have Aboriginal architects in the team was very, very significant to them. So it's a much more complex process than kind of, only talking about sort of outdoor leisure activities, which of course, the airport being close to the Blue Mountains, you can have excursions there, you can see some really amazing landscapes. But that goes hand in hand with really creating something that's much more of a national gateway for the project. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Cristiano. And I think we'll take, this is the last question so that we can wrap up on the hour. It's kind of interesting. It was supposed to be 1.5 hours, but we went 3 hours. So this is double whammy, part one, part two. I think the video will have to be posted that way. But you know, what I thought maybe is an interesting, you know, question. Maybe Brian, this is a question that was directed to you. How does our headlong rush and avalanche, even to urbanization in Africa, Asia, South America, relate to and even acknowledge cultural sustainability?
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question. And I was thinking already before the question arrived, based on some of the comments that my Zaha Hadid colleagues were bringing forward, the idea of cultural sensitivity and response, and in particular, as we consider that in terms of sustainability, is remarkably complex. There's many dimensions to it, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to juggle all those challenges. I guess one thing I'd put forward is it's far less about right and wrong and far more about appropriateness, about a consideration of context and a sort of embrace and response to conditions. I think it's okay to be critical, as Patrik was saying before, about sort of questioning what we're receiving, what we're seeing in our quest to understand. It's okay to interrogate intentions and outcomes. I think that's our responsibility to do that. But I think we need to avoid being overly judgmental and certainly being righteous. And there's so much of that. You know, I've worked in a lot of countries, and the sort of finger pointing and you're getting it wrong or you're getting it right is a path we need to avoid. As an example of that, I was thinking, for example, Zaha Hadid's new project in the Emirates, and comparing that to, Sam, the projects we saw in our Nigerian competition for the Plateau State, you know, dealing with mud bricks and dealing with what one can construct in a community versus what you need cranes and high technology to construct. They're not comparable, and they shouldn't be compared. The metrics, the measures, the expectations, the results need to be assessed in their own right, and in sort of consideration of what's going on locally. You know, I think there are truths and there are science-based things we can be looking at that sort of transcend culture and national boundaries. But that said, I think we need to be far more sort of accepting that there is going to be difference. Finally, I think architects by training and inclination are really well equipped to deal with this kind of complexity that we've all been talking about today. But that said, I would argue that we need to rethink and retool some, maybe many aspects of our approach in what all of us have been talking today is a dramatically changing and sort of shifting milieu. So I'll end with that, Sam, and extend my thanks to the Zaha Hadid team, to you, Sam, and to the Athabasca team for putting this really pretty amazing and productive session together. So thank you.
No, thank you very much, Brian. And I'm sure, you know, this session wouldn't be complete without putting in a COVID question, because there is one question on COVID. So I was going to wrap up with it on a high note. And initially, the question was actually directed to Patrik, and then another question around the COVID was directed to Brian, you know, and Patrik, but I thought it would be a good one. So I'm going to combine, you know, the two of them. The first one was, what is your view? This is to Patrik. What is your view on the public space, in parentheses, under the umbrella of working from home, especially in terms of culture, art, joy, and things that, you know, Brian mentioned. So, you know, the question is, what is your view on public space, you know, now that we're working from home? And then finally, how can the public continue to flow through your buildings with COVID and the pandemic and the work and stay at home culture, which is now a new culture, you know? So I think we can wrap up, you know, with that. Brian, maybe you finish, you continue, and then Patrik, you know.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly because that's really a good question for Patrik.
Yeah.
I think, you know, the COVID thing, the pandemic, it's not the first, it won't be the last. I think we need to be responsive as architects and designers and occupiers of buildings to some of the issues. But that said, and I encourage my students in studio not to become overly focused on some of the aspects that will go away. Now, we still need to be mindful of those things. And I was reminded Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum and in his book, The Great Reset, talks about reflection, reimagination, and a reset of our world. So I think the pandemic and its arrival gives us pause to sort of stop, to critically examine where we're at, and to deal with things that are far more than just about architecture and space and masks and vaccines. So there's a lot of longer downstream issues that I think the architecture profession, architects, architecture students need to consider moving forward. So I'll turn it over to Patrik.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I mean, I think that we will get out of this. There will be a herd immunity and vaccination, and we will be back. But I think the home working condition will continue for many, and so the urban life will have a different character. I think it will be younger crowds. It will be the office will be more of a socializing and networking and event based rather than routine work. Not everybody will participate and commute in, which makes for a more pleasant urban environment. And those who want to be part of it can now move in, because I think half of the office space will disappear. So there are a lot of changes, and I hope that our systems are flexible enough to allow these to be discovered. It's agile enough to do that. So that's my vision of what's coming. I think it's going to be an interesting and better life. And why I'm saying this, I mean, what I've noticed is that in the summer, when things eased off and one could have gone back to work, that didn't happen in England. I mean, everybody kept working from home because it was convenient, but the bars, clubs, restaurants, public spaces, they were massively crowded, particularly in the younger urban districts. I mean, I live in Shoreditch here in London, East London. I mean, it was unbelievable. Everybody was out and about and communicating, and particularly, of course, it's the younger crowd is much more dependent on that, and you can't substitute for that easily. But they were not working. They were working from home, but they were out in the city enjoying the social life. So that is for me the indication that urban concentration will continue, but it will be a different character of a city. And a lot of routine work can be done from home, so that there will be a new dynamic, and I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And Craig and Cristiano and Brian and Patrik, I really thank all of you for the time spent. I'm sure it's also very late there in the UK. I mean, it was
a pleasure, Sam.
Yeah, it's 1 p.m. here. Really thank you all, and thank you to Athabasca University. Thank you to University of Calgary School of Architecture and planning and landscape, right? Brian, this is really this has really been fun and really exciting to discuss this very important topic. So I'll pass on to Henry, if but over here I think we're done. We're happy, and thank you. It's been a 3 hours well spent. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I very much enjoyed that.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you.
So Henry.
Yes. So just some final housekeeping notes. Well, first of all, thank you for everyone's time today and for the extended version of the virtual lecture series. I think this is the first time where the Q&A session was actually longer than the presentation. So I think that's a good indication of how exciting and how important the conversations around this topic was on culturally sustainable design. So thank you, Brian, Patrik, Craig, and Cristiano for taking the time to talk to us today. And of course, Sam for moderating the great moderation work in compiling the questions. One last shout out to the AU team as well, Douglas, Veronica, Trevor, Carol, and Lara, who have been instrumental in preparing for this presentation. And also just to note that because this presentation will be on our YouTube channel in the next week, I've already posted the link in the chat box for those of you who would like to see it again or share it to whomever who did not have a chance to see it today. Finally, we will also be issuing certificates for those of you who would like to receive a certificate to apply for professional development in your architectural with your architectural associations. I will be sending the instructions to receive certificates shortly. So with that, I will end the session, and thank you again. I don't want to be between anyone who needs to go to bed or who is going for dinner or lunch. So thank you again very much. And
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.